There is a book in the rare book room of a university library, bound in cloth gone the color of weak tea, its spine cracked in exactly one place. Page 211. That is where the reader always stops. That is where a servant, writing in her own hand in 1868, quoted a letter written to her by the widow of a murdered president. And that is the page that ended her. For nearly a century after it was published, this book was almost impossible to find. Not banned. Something quieter than banned. Bought up, in some accounts, by a family with the money and the motive to make a printing simply disappear from circulation. The woman who wrote it did not have that kind of money. She had a needle, a subscription list, and 30 years of secrets she had decided, finally, to spend. Her name was Elizabeth Keckley. She dressed the wife of the President of the Confederacy and then the wife of the President of the Union, sometimes in the same year, sometimes for women who would come to hate each other. She was the last person Mary Todd Lincoln wanted in the room when her son died, and the first person she called when her husband did too. And then she wrote it all down, and Washington decided that the one unforgivable act of a former slave was not standing too close to power. It was describing what she saw there. To understand what her book actually cost her, you must forget how memoirs function now. A modern reader assumes a tell-all is survivable, even profitable. That scandal generates its own kind of currency. In 1868, for a black woman describing her intimacy with a former First Lady, the opposite was true. There was no publicity machine to convert outrage into sales. There was only a closing door, city by city, client by client, until the woman who had once measured the waistlines of senators' wives could not book a single fitting in the capital she had helped clothe through a civil war. We will get to the book. We will get to page 211. But first, we have to go to the end, because with Elizabeth Keckley, the end is the only place the shape of the whole story becomes visible, the only vantage from which you can see what the beginning was actually building toward. Washington, D.C., the 1890s, sliding toward the turn of a new century. A modest brick building not far from Howard University, run by a black benevolent society, housing elderly and indigent black women who had nowhere else to be. Call it what it was, stripped of the softening language of charity, a warehouse for the discarded. Elizabeth Keckley had helped found an institution very like it decades earlier, when the Capitol still filled seasonally with formerly enslaved people who needed exactly this kind of shelter. Now, in the last chapter of her own life, she was living inside one. She was in her 70s, then her 80s. Her hands, the instrument of the only fortune she ever built, the hands that had once measured the waistline of a First Lady with a precision no other modiste in Washington could match, had gone stiff with age and arthritis, the specific cruelty of a body that outlives the one skill it was ever permitted to monetize. She had, by some accounts, a small government pension tied to her son's Union Army service, a young man dead more than 30 years by then, killed before his 20th birthday in a war whose outcome he never lived to see decided. The pension, such as it was, amounted to a few dollars a month. It was not enough. It was rarely enough for anyone in her position. Old money endows a wing, names a library, funds a chair at a university for 100 years. Old labor, when it finally runs out, gets a cot in a shared room and a line in an admissions ledger. Think for a moment about what she must have been able to see from that room and what she could not. She could see, if she still read the papers, that Robert Todd Lincoln, the boy whose family she had once comforted through the worst nights of their lives, was by then a wealthy corporate lawyer and former cabinet secretary, a man of considerable means living in considerable comfort. She could not see, because history had not yet delivered it, that the book which had cost her everything would eventually be recognized as one of the most valuable surviving windows into his own family's private life. This is the detail that collapses the entire fiction of her later biographers, who wanted a triumphant final act. There wasn't one. She did not die surrounded by grateful clients or celebrated as a memoirist ahead of her time. She died in January of 1907 in a home for women exactly like the one she had once employed and organized and lifted, in a room that was not her own, having outlived nearly everyone who could have vouched for what she had actually done. Here is the arithmetic of an American life, laid out the way a balance sheet is laid out, debit and credit, and you decide which column is longer. Credit bought her own freedom and her son's for a sum most working people of the era would need years to save. Credit built a clientele of the most powerful women in the capital of a nation fighting to end slavery, while she herself was, for the first months of that fight, still on paper in another state, someone else's asset. Credit founded a relief society that fed and clothed thousands of formerly enslaved people arriving in Washington with nothing but the clothes they had fled in. Credit wrote and published, in her own name, one of the only surviving first-hand accounts of both American bondage and the private life of a wartime presidency. Debit, a business that collapsed within a year of that book's publication. Debit, a circle of former friends and clients who crossed the street rather than acknowledge her. Debit, decades of quiet, undocumented poverty. Debit, a death in an institution built for women who had run out of every alternative. Total the columns honestly, the way you would for any figure in this channel's usual subject, the railroad men, the copper barons, the department store dynasties, and you get a woman who was punished not for what she did, but for what she said out loud, in her own words, about the people who had let her do it. So we begin at the end because the end asks the only question worth asking about Elizabeth Keckley. Not, how did a formerly enslaved woman come to dress a first lady, which is the version of this story polite society has always preferred, softened into a Cinderella arc with a happy ending implied. The real question is colder. What is a black woman's discretion worth to white power? And what happens the instant she stops supplying it for free? To answer that, we have to rewind nearly 90 years to a birth that was itself already a kind of theft. A cabin did not have a birth certificate. It had, at best, a line in a ledger, property added, like a foal or a length of cloth. And even that entry, if it ever existed, has not survived. What has survived is a consensus among biographers, built from her own later account and from the documentary residue of the families who owned her. She was born around 1818 in Dinwiddie County, Virginia, to an enslaved woman named Agnes Hobbs. She would spend her adult life keeping one fact carefully unstated in public and stated plainly in private, in her own memoir. The man who almost certainly fathered her was not her mother's husband. It was, by her own account, the white man who enslaved them both. This was not confession. It was arithmetic of another kind. the reality that in the world she was born into, a white man's access to a black woman's body required no permission and produced no scandal, only children who then belonged to him twice over, once as offspring and once as property. She grew up understaffed, undersheltered, and, this is the detail her later employers in Washington would have found difficult to square with the frightened, deferential servant they imagined they were hiring, extraordinarily observant. A child who is property learns early that survival depends on reading a room before she is permitted to speak in it. That skill would later be mistaken by powerful white women for loyalty. It was not loyalty, it was intelligence, deployed in the only currency the system allowed her to spend. Consider what her childhood actually consisted of, item by item, the way you would itemize any ledger this channel puts in front of you. No schooling, of course. Literacy was, in most of the antebellum South, actively illegal for the enslaved to acquire, and what reading and writing she eventually mastered she gathered in fragments, unofficially, the way the enslaved always did, one stolen lesson at a time. No control over her own labor, her own location, her own name on any document that mattered, and no guarantee ever that the family she had that week would be the family she had the next. Mothers separated from children, siblings sold apart, an entire economy that treated kinship as inventory subject to relocation. She was moved over the course of her childhood and young adulthood among at least 3 different owning families and at least 2 states. Every move erased what little stability the last one had allowed her to build. She was put to work as a seamstress's assistant almost as soon as her hands could hold a needle, and by her teenage years she was doing the fine, exacting work herself. Hems, bodices, the architecture of a woman's public silhouette, built stitch by invisible stitch. It is worth pausing on this because it is the mechanism of everything that follows. In a system designed to erase her personhood, she found the one skill valuable enough that white women would, eventually, have to treat her like a professional rather than a possession, not out of respect, out of need. They could not sew like she could. That gap between what she could do and what they could not would become, slowly, unbelievably, her leverage. But leverage arrived slowly, and cruelty arrived first. She endured, in her own later telling, years of violent treatment under one enslaver in North Carolina, a school teacher, by her account, who considered her insufficiently obedient and set about correcting that with the whip repeatedly over an extended period, until, by some accounts, a neighboring man intervened on grounds of simple decency rather than law, because the law offered her none. She described this period when she finally wrote her memoir decades later with restraint rather than spectacle, naming what happened without lingering in its detail, the way a person testifies rather than the way a person performs. That choice tells you something about a woman who understood, even then, that dignity was the one thing that could not be beaten out of a narrative if she controlled the narrating. There was also, in this same period, an assault she referenced only obliquely in her later writing, an experience common enough among enslaved women of her era to require no further elaboration for readers who understood the world she was describing, and painful enough that she chose not to elaborate for readers who did not deserve the detail. What she did state plainly was its consequence, the birth of her only son, George, whose father was a white man, and whose existence she would spend the rest of her working life laboring to protect, educate, and eventually, at devastating cost, watch fight for a country that had not yet decided whether men who looked like him deserved to be citizens of it. By the 1840s, she had been transferred, sold, given, bequeathed, the vocabulary itself, a small daily violence, into the household of Hugh Garland in St. Louis, Missouri, along with her mother. And it was in St. Louis that the ledger began, very slowly, to tilt. A household does not run on air. The Garland family, like most families that measured their standing in the number of people they owned rather than the money they had, discovered in St. Louis that standing and solvency are not the same thing. They had relocated from Virginia carrying debts as well as dependents, and they were, by several accounts, in genuine financial distress once they arrived. The kind of quiet, humiliating decline that respectable families do not advertise. The kind that shows up not in bankruptcy filings, but in mortgaged furniture and unpaid tradesmen's bills, and daughters whose marriage prospects quietly narrow. And the person who kept that household fed, clothed, and presentable to the outside world, who kept the fiction of Garland respectability intact for the neighbors, was the enslaved woman whose skill with a needle had, by this point, become locally famous. Consider the mechanics of what locally famous actually meant for a woman in her position. It did not mean recognition. It meant demand. Carriages arriving at odd hours with fabric and an urgent deadline, the wives of judges and merchants requesting her specifically, by name, for gowns that would be worn to balls she would never be permitted to attend. She was, in every functional sense except the legal one, running a business, taking commissions, managing a growing volume of work, training at least one apprentice of her own eventually, and negotiating, however carefully, the terms under which her enslaver would permit her to keep any portion of what she earned. That last negotiation is the one worth dwelling on, because it is where the entire moral architecture of slavery reveals itself most plainly. Every dollar she was permitted to keep was permitted, not earned in any sense the law recognized, and could be revoked as arbitrarily as it had been granted. She was, in effect, a business owner required to submit her own books for her ownership's approval, an entrepreneur whose largest single business risk was not competition or bad debts, but the mood of the man who legally held the title to her body. Here is the number, and you should sit with it before you move past it. Elizabeth Keckley's dressmaking income, by her own account and corroborated by the historical record of the period, supported an entire household of 17 people. 17, herself included, and her enslavers, and by extension their children's education, their food, the roof over all their heads, funded by the needle of a woman who owned none of it, not the roof, not the food, not, in the eyes of the law, herself. Say that plainly, because it is the sentence this entire story pivots on. An enslaved woman was, for years, the sole functioning economic engine of the family that enslaved her. Consider what that meant in practice on an ordinary Tuesday. The Garland daughters needed gowns for a cotillion the family could not otherwise have afforded to attend respectably. Hugh Garland needed his household to present, to creditors and to neighbors alike, as a family still comfortably in command of its circumstances, rather than one quietly hemorrhaging money. Every stitch Elizabeth Keckley put into a client's commission did double duty. It earned outside income the family could tax for its own survival, and it manufactured, for public consumption, exactly the illusion of stability the Garlands could no longer generate on their own. She was not merely supporting the household. She was manufacturing its credibility, one gown at a time, for people who owned her. What did the Garlands do with that information? Not free her, not pay her a wage commensurate with what she generated. They allowed her, allowed is the word the law would have used, to take in outside work, to build a client list beyond the household, on the understanding that a portion of what she earned would continue to prop up the family's finances. It was, in miniature, the entire economic logic of American slavery. Extract the value, control the vessel, call the arrangement generosity. But value, once demonstrated, is difficult to fully contain. Her client list grew. Her reputation in St. Louis grew. And somewhere in the calculus of a family that could not survive without her, but could not admit that dependency out loud, an opening appeared. In 1855, Elizabeth Keckley proposed to purchase her own freedom, and that of her son, for the sum of $1,200. Sit with that figure the way you would sit with any large number this channel puts in front of you. $1,200 in 1855 was not pocket change. It was, depending on the estimate, somewhere in the range of what a skilled tradesman might earn across 1 to 2 full years of labor, a sum well beyond the reach of most free working people of any race in mid-century Missouri. It was a mortgage on a life. It was, in the coldest possible terms, the market's own valuation of 2 human beings, a mother and her son, stated to the dollar, negotiated like a promissory note, because that is precisely what it was, a financial instrument, drawn up with the same seriousness a bank would apply to any other secured loan, except that the collateral could talk, could sew, and had spent years silently underwriting the very household now setting the price of her own release. She did not have it, not remotely. What she had was a client base of white women in St. Louis who had come, grudgingly or genuinely, to respect her enough to lend it to her, a network of patrons, mostly women, who advanced her the capital to buy herself out of bondage, to be repaid, naturally, out of future earnings from the very skill that had generated the sum in the first place. By her own account, one client in particular, a Mrs. Le Bourgeois, was instrumental in organizing the loan among a small circle of women willing to stake their own money on the proposition that Elizabeth Keckley was, in fact, good for it. It is worth noting, without romanticizing it, that the same system of white patronage that would later destroy her reputation in Washington is the system that first purchased her out of slavery in St. Louis. Power granted her freedom in one city and revoked her standing in another, and both decisions were made by white women deciding in the moment what a black woman's usefulness was worth to them. Weigh the deal itself for a moment, because it was not generosity, however, it has been remembered. It was a loan at a price extended to a woman who had no legal standing to default and no recourse if the terms had suddenly changed. She was, in effect, purchasing an asset herself from one set of white owners with borrowed capital supplied by another, and then spending the next several years of labor paying down the debt on her own body. Freedom, in 1855 Missouri, was not abolished into existence. It was financed, like a mortgage, and she was both the collateral and the customer, the only party in the transaction with no legal recourse if any of the terms were quietly rewritten against her. She repaid the loan. Every dollar, methodically, out of continued dressmaking income until the debt was cleared and the papers were, finally, unambiguously hers. And in 1860, with her freedom finally, legally her own, and her son already a young man, she did what every ambitious professional in America has always done when a provincial market stops being big enough for the scale of what they believe they can build. She went to the capital. Washington in 1860 was a city that did not yet know it was about to become the most important city in the hemisphere. It was Southern in temperament, federal in function, and this is the part that made Elizabeth Keckley's timing either extraordinary luck or extraordinary instinct, about to become the epicenter of the argument that would decide whether people like her would ever be property again. She arrived with almost nothing beyond a needle, a reputation built 2 states away, and a plan. Washington in 1860 was, socially, a smaller and more concentrated version of what New York or Boston offered. A few hundred families who mattered, cycling in and out of the same handful of drawing rooms, and a much larger population of everyone else, largely invisible to the historical record. To break into the first category from outside it, with no family name and no capital beyond her own hands, required a kind of professional aggression that the polite version of this story tends to sand down into simple hard work. It was hard work. It was also, undeniably, ambition, the same quality that would have been celebrated without qualification in a white male entrepreneur of the period, and was, in her case, invisible enough in the record that historians have had to reconstruct it from results rather than from any contemporary who thought to praise it directly. Within months, that ambition had produced results that read, even now, like fiction. Her clients included the wives of senators and cabinet officials, women who did not, as a rule, entrust their public image to just anyone. And this is the detail every version of this story has to reckon with. Varina Davis, wife of Mississippi Senator and soon-to-be Confederate President Jefferson Davis, a free black businesswoman dressing the future First Lady of a nation, founded explicitly to preserve her own enslavement. That is not irony. That is the precise, uncomfortable texture of America in 1860, a country where commerce moved faster than conscience, where a talented seamstress's hands were wanted regardless of what her freedom papers said about the moral character of the household she served. But the country that had employed her that way was collapsing in real time, month by month, underneath the very drawing rooms she was sewing for. By early 1861, secession was no longer theoretical. State after state across the Deep South severed itself from the Union, and in Washington, the wives of Southern senators began the quiet, practical business of packing, deciding what furniture to ship south, which friendships to preserve across the coming divide, which servants and employees to bring with them into a new nation being built explicitly on the permanence of what Elizabeth Keckley had spent her whole life trying to escape. By some accounts, Varina Davis offered to bring Elizabeth Keckley south with the family to continue as her modiste in the new Confederate capital, an offer that, if accepted, would have placed a free black businesswoman inside the founding government of a nation whose Constitution enshrined slavery as a permanent institution, dressing the wife of the man who would preside over it. It is worth sitting with how strange that offer actually was, stripped of hindsight. Verena Davis was not asking a stranger. She was asking a woman whose skill she valued enough to want to keep in a life about to be uprooted, regardless of the moral incoherence of the request itself. She declined. The historical record does not preserve a transcript of her reasoning, and any account of her exact motivations risks inventing certainty where none exists. What can be said plainly is this: whatever combination of instinct, principle, family obligation, and plain professional self-preservation drove that decision, it is arguably the single most consequential choice of her working life. Had she gone south, she would have vanished into the private household staff of a government at war with her own freedom. And this story, in all likelihood, would not exist in any form we could tell it today. Instead, she stayed in a half-emptied capital bracing for war, precisely when the wife of a newly inaugurated president from Illinois, a woman nobody else wanted the job of dressing, socially radioactive before she had unpacked a single trunk, needed a modiste and had none. That wife was Mary Todd Lincoln. Understand who Mary Lincoln was before you understand what Elizabeth Keckley became to her, because the relationship only makes sense once you see the vacancy it filled. Mary Lincoln arrived in Washington in 1861 as a woman from the frontier, Kentucky-born, Springfield-raised, walking into a capital of hereditary northeastern wealth that regarded her, almost uniformly, as an outsider with pretensions above her origin. She was mocked for her spending. She was mocked for her accent. She was, in the vicious private language of a capital that specializes in this particular cruelty, considered common, a word that, in that context, meant something closer to unworthy than to ordinary. Washington society at the outbreak of war was, in its own way, as brutal an economy of judgment as any this channel has covered. Fortunes and reputations rose and fell not on income, but on bloodline, on the correct accent, on the invisible choreography of which invitations one accepted and which one was seen to decline. Mary Lincoln had none of the inherited fluency that protected the capital's old families from that judgment, and she compensated, as outsiders often do, by trying to outspend the very people mocking her, a strategy that only confirmed in their eyes exactly the vulgarity they had already decided to see in her. What she needed, in that hostile climate, was not a friend in the ordinary sense. Friends in Washington were plentiful and mostly false, useful chiefly for carrying information back to whichever salon most wanted to hear it. What she needed was someone who could make her look every single day like she belonged in rooms that had already decided she didn't. Someone whose skill could out-argue the whispering, and who would never, under any circumstance, repeat what she saw while doing it. A modiste sees a woman undressed, financially and emotionally, as much as literally, the debts behind the gowns, the tears behind the composure required to wear them in public an hour later. That is an extraordinary amount of power to hand a single person. Mary Lincoln handed it to a woman she had known for a matter of weeks, because she had, by that point, almost no one else left to hand it to. Elizabeth Keckley became that person within weeks of their introduction, and the proof of how quickly the relationship escalated is not sentimental. It is practical, documented, exact. By her own account, she was engaged to make the gown Mary Lincoln wore to one of the first major receptions of the new administration, working under a deadline so tight that failure would have meant the new First Lady appearing before Washington society on one of the most scrutinized nights of her public life, in something less than her best. Elizabeth Keckley delivered. That single act of professional reliability under pressure in the earliest days of an administration nobody in Washington yet respected is the transaction the entire friendship was built on top of. Trust in this story, as in most of the stories this channel tells, was never abstract. It was earned one deadline, one flawless seam, one crisis averted at a time. She was hired formally as Mrs. Lincoln's personal modiste, the maker of her wardrobe, the architect of her public silhouette for the entirety of the Lincoln presidency, present for nearly every major public appearance the administration made across 4 of the most consequential years in American history. But modiste is the word for the invoice. What she actually became was something the era had no polite name for: confidant, dresser, secret keeper, household manager, and, increasingly, unmistakably, friend, in a friendship that violated nearly every social rule of the century that produced it. White women of Mary Lincoln's class did not, as a rule, confide financial anxieties, marital tensions, or private grief to black employees, however skilled. Mary Lincoln did, consistently, for 4 years, apparently without a second thought about how unusual that was. We should pause here because a country that is watching this channel wants a moment of levity before the story turns, and we owe you one. So think about what part of the country you're watching this from right now. We get viewers from 6 continents on stories like this one, and consider that the woman at the center of it never left a 100-mile radius of Virginia and Washington in her entire working life, and still ended up dressing 2 opposing first ladies inside of 1 decade. Tell us where you're watching from. Then let's go back to 1862, because that is when the friendship stopped being professional and became something else entirely. In February of 1862, Willie Lincoln, the president's 11-year-old son, by every account the child Mary Lincoln loved most uncomplicatedly, died of what was likely typhoid fever inside the White House, while the country outside its windows was already counting its war dead by the tens of thousands. Mary Lincoln's grief was not decorous, it was total, and by several accounts nearly incapacitating. She could not attend the funeral, could not, for a long stretch afterward, function in the ordinary rhythms of her own household, and would by some accounts continue to hold seances in the White House years later in an attempt to reach him. The people around her, even the president himself, occupied by a war that would not pause for a father's mourning, and by some accounts so concerned for his wife's mental state that he warned her she risked being institutionalized if she could not master her grief, did not know what to do with sorrow that large. Willie's death, it is worth noting, was not an isolated tragedy in that house. His younger brother Tad was gravely ill in the same room during the same period, and the household spent that winter uncertain whether it would lose one child or 2. Elizabeth Keckley did. She sat with Mary Lincoln. She managed the sick room, and then the deathbed, and then the aftermath in ways the historical record treats almost as fact beyond dispute. She was, in the darkest room in the White House, the person Mary Todd Lincoln trusted enough to simply be present. Not advise, not console with words. Be there, hands working or hands still, for as long as it took. This is the detail that should stop you, because it says everything the polite version of this story tends to skip past. A black woman who had been, within the living memory of nearly everyone in that house, legally purchasable, was the person a grieving white mother in the highest office in the land let closest to her unraveling. Status in that room briefly did not matter. Grief had leveled it. It would not stay leveled. And Elizabeth Keckley's own losses were running in grim parallel. On a timeline, the standard telling of this story too often compresses into a single sentence, as if one grief were a footnote to the other rather than its equal. Her only son, George, light-skinned enough, by some accounts, to pass as a white man, and determined enough to enlist on those terms rather than be barred from service in an army that would not, in 1861, accept black volunteers in combat roles at all, had joined a Missouri regiment at the war's very outbreak. Consider what that decision actually required of him: erasing, for the purpose of a recruiting officer's ledger, the identity of the mother who had spent years buying his freedom in order to fight for the Union that freedom depended on. He was killed at the Battle of Wilson's Creek in August of 1861, one of the earliest major engagements of the war, a Union defeat in the Missouri hills, months before Willie Lincoln ever fell ill in the White House nursery. She learned of her son's death, in other words, while she was only just beginning to establish herself as a professional presence inside a White House that did not yet fully trust her, in a city where she had lived for barely a year. There was no interval to grieve privately before the next fitting, the next deadline, the next crisis requiring her hands rather than her heart. Put those two griefs next to each other, hers and Mary Lincoln's, separated by less than a year, and do not look away from the asymmetry. A mother who had paid, in cash, for her own child's freedom watched him die anyway, fighting for a Union that would not yet let him serve as what he actually was under his own name as her son. And within months, that same mother was the person holding together a president's wife over the death of a boy who had never known a single day of danger in his short life. Grief does not distribute along the lines power draws. It never has. It simply accumulates unevenly on whoever is left standing closest to the person doing the dying. It was in this same period, grieving her son, absorbing Mary Lincoln's collapse, watching the Capitol fill with formerly enslaved people fleeing north with nothing but the clothes on their backs, that Elizabeth Keckley did something that history remembers far less than it should. She founded, in 1862, the Contraband Relief Association, later renamed the Ladies, Freedmen, and Soldiers Relief Association, an organization built to feed, clothe, and house the refugees the war was displacing by the thousands into a capital utterly unprepared to receive them. Washington's contraband camps, the term itself borrowed chillingly from the language of confiscated property, since escaped enslaved people were initially classified by the Union Army as captured enemy assets rather than as free persons, held thousands of men, women, and children living in conditions of disease and deprivation that horrified even hardened observers of the war. Into that vacuum, Elizabeth Keckley organized. She used her own proximity to power, soliciting donations from Mrs. Lincoln directly, corresponding with Frederick Douglass, appealing to black churches and mutual aid societies as far away as Boston, to raise funds and material relief on a scale that a woman with her formal resources should not, by any ordinary measure, have been able to organize. She was, in effect, running two full-time operations simultaneously in the same building complex and the same social circle, the intimate, invisible labor of dressing and comforting the nation's grieving First Lady, and the public, organizational labor of building a relief network for thousands of the nation's newly freed. Very few people in Washington in 1862 were doing either. She was doing both. Consider the arithmetic of her days in that single year, dressing a First Lady by morning, managing a grieving woman's household by afternoon, organizing relief for refugees of her own former condition by evening, all while carrying a grief of her own that nobody in that White House was managing for her. This is the detail that collapses the fiction of the loyal servant narrative for good. She was not absorbing white grief because she had none of her own to attend to. She was doing it because it was, in the coldest terms, the terms this channel has always used for such arrangements: her job, her mission, and her only available form of standing, all three at once. The friendship deepened through the war's remaining years, and then, in April of 1865, 5 days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox, Abraham Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater and died the next morning. Elizabeth Keckley was, once again, the person Mary Lincoln summoned. She traveled from her own home in the middle of the night to sit with the new widow through that first unbearable night, and remained close to her, managing her in every sense of the word, through the collapse of Mary Lincoln's finances and stability over the following years, through what became, by 1867, an open national scandal. That scandal deserves its own accounting, because it is the hinge the entire second half of this story turns on. Mary Lincoln left the White House with a smaller estate than the public assumed, and no pension yet established by a Congress that took years to grant her one. A widow of a martyred president, reduced within 2 years to genuine anxiety about how she would live. In genuine financial distress, she attempted, secretly, and then not secretly at all, to sell off a portion of her wardrobe and jewelry through a New York broker, traveling under an assumed name in an episode the press, once it caught the scent, dubbed the Old Clothes Scandal. Elizabeth Keckley traveled with her to New York, helped arrange the consignment, negotiated with the brokers, and did everything in her professional capacity to manage a transaction that was, at its core, simply a desperate woman trying to convert unworn silk into rent money. It did not work. The press discovered the scheme within days, and rather than treating it with the sympathy a grieving widow's financial panic might have earned her, the newspapers treated it as confirmation of everything Washington already whispered about Mary Lincoln. Vanity, instability, a woman who had embarrassed the Republic once already and was now embarrassing it again. She was humiliated on a genuinely national stage, mocked in print from Boston to San Francisco. And Elizabeth Keckley, the woman who had tried, quietly, professionally, competently, to help a friend avoid exactly that outcome, absorbed a portion of the fallout simply for having been present at all. The newspapers that covered the scandal did not fail to note that a black modiste had accompanied the former First Lady on her humiliating errand, framing her presence as one more strange, faintly suspicious detail in an already scandalous story, rather than as what it actually was, a professional discreetly trying to help a client through a crisis that was, in every particular, not of the professional's making. It is worth naming what that episode actually was, stripped of sentiment, a former First Lady's private catastrophe, mediated entirely by the labor and discretion of a black woman who received for her trouble public suspicion instead of gratitude. This is the pattern this channel has traced across a dozen dynasties now. The closer you stand to the collapse of power, the more of its blame accumulates on you, and the less of its protection you're extended in return. Elizabeth Keckley emerged from the old clothes scandal with her reputation dented but intact. What came next would not leave it intact at all. Washington in the years immediately after the war was, for a black professional woman of Elizabeth Keckley's standing, a city of narrowing rather than widening opportunity, whatever the formal legal gains of Reconstruction might have suggested on paper. Emancipation was law. Citizenship for the formerly enslaved was being written, amendment by contested amendment, into the Constitution itself, in real time, a few miles from her workshop. And yet, the social machinery of the Capitol, the invitations, the client referrals, the invisible network by which a modiste's reputation actually functioned from one season to the next, remained almost entirely in the hands of the same white families who had run it before the war, now simply rearranging themselves around a changed legal landscape, rather than a changed set of underlying assumptions about who belonged in which room. Legal freedom, Elizabeth Keckley had already learned once in St. Louis, and would learn again in Washington, was never quite the same thing as full personhood in the eyes of the people who still controlled the invitations. By 1868, Elizabeth Keckley's dressmaking business, the very thing that had funded her freedom, sustained her through a war, and kept her afloat through years of proximity to a First Lady's unraveling, was struggling. Clients were fewer. The Capitol's memory of the old clothes scandal had not fully faded, and her association with it, however unfair, had cost her some of the standing she'd spent a decade building. She was, by this point, approaching 50, a black woman running an increasingly precarious business in a capital whose appetite for wartime glamour had moved on with the war itself. She made a decision that, in retrospect, historians have read two ways, and honesty requires presenting both. The generous reading, she wrote her memoir, Behind the Scenes, or 30 Years a Slave and 4 years in the White House, partly to defend Mary Lincoln's character against the public ridicule of the old clothes affair, laying out the financial desperation and grief that had actually driven it, and partly to finally tell her own extraordinary story on her own terms. As a formerly enslaved woman who had witnessed the innermost workings of the Union's wartime government from a vantage almost no one else of any race had occupied. The less generous reading, which circulated at the time and has never fully disappeared, that she needed money, and a memoir describing her intimacy with a former First Lady, including private letters Mary Lincoln had written her, was the most valuable asset she had left to sell, and she sold it. Both readings can be true at once. People are rarely purely one thing, and a woman who had spent her entire life converting invisible labor into visible survival was not about to stop doing so now. At the one moment, she had a story valuable enough to be worth telling. She worked, by some accounts, with a ghostwriter or editorial collaborator to shape the manuscript for publication, common practice for memoirs of the era regardless of the author's race. But the voice, the structure, and unmistakably the choice of what to include and what to withhold were hers. The book itself was, by the standards of its era, remarkable, and deserves to be described on its own terms before we describe its destruction. It opened with her enslavement in Virginia and North Carolina, moved through the St. Louis years and the purchase of her freedom, and then, in its second half, into an intimate, granular account of 4 years inside the Lincoln White House. The fittings, the small domestic details of a presidential family at war, the specific texture of Mary Lincoln's grief over Willie, and finally, the old clothes affair, told from the inside with sympathy by the one person positioned to explain why a former First Lady would resort to selling her own dresses. It was, in its way, one of the first books in American publishing written by a formerly enslaved woman about her direct, personal, unmediated proximity to the highest levels of national power. There was no precedent for it, and Washington did not know what shelf to put it on. What made it detonate was not the slavery narrative. Antebellum and wartime slave narratives, while still controversial, had an established public appetite by 1868. What made it detonate was the second half. Reproduced in the book, largely in full, were private letters Mary Lincoln had written to Elizabeth Keckley. Candid, unguarded correspondence, never intended for publication, discussing money, grief, and the former First Lady's private state of mind in terms she had shared with almost no one else alive. This is the material on page 211 and the pages around it, the section that would define the book's reception far more than anything else inside its covers, more than the 30 years of bondage that preceded it, more than the war, more than the assassination itself. The reaction was immediate, and it was not, in its substance, about slavery at all. It was about class, discretion, and who was permitted to know what about whom, and to say so in print. Washington and New York society did not receive the book as a courageous historical document. They received it as a betrayal, a servant publishing her employer's private correspondence, a black woman speaking with an intimacy about a former First Lady's grief and finances that white society believed she had no standing to claim, regardless of how true or how sympathetically rendered every word of it actually was. Newspaper commentary at the time focused overwhelmingly on the impropriety of a former servant reproducing a great lady's private letters, treating the question of accuracy as almost beside the point. The offense was not that she had lied. The offense was that she had spoken at all. Robert Todd Lincoln, Mary Lincoln's surviving son, by several accounts deeply protective of his family's public image, and already engaged in what would become a lifelong campaign to control how his father's legacy and his mother's reputation would be remembered, a campaign that in later decades would see him destroy or restrict access to substantial portions of his father's private papers, was, by multiple accounts, instrumental in suppressing the book's circulation, whether through direct pressure on the publisher, arrangements to buy up and withdraw copies, or simply the chilling effect of a powerful young lawyer's evident displeasure rippling through New York publishing circles. The practical result was the same. A book that should have been a landmark of American publishing quietly, effectively, almost disappeared from circulation within a year of its release. And so did Elizabeth Keckley's business. Former clients stopped calling one by one in the particular quiet way that social exile operates among people too polite to state their reasons directly. An unanswered note, a fitting suddenly no longer necessary, a friend of a friend mentioning that perhaps another modiste might now be more suitable. Society that had tolerated, even quietly valued, her discretion for over a decade now treated the fact that she had ever known anything at all as the offense itself. She had spent 30 years converting invisible labor into a form of standing, one commission and one kept confidence at a time. In the space of a single publication, that standing evaporated, and unlike a dress that could be remade, it did not come back. This is the sentence to sit with, because it is the thesis of the entire film. A black woman was punished not for crossing a boundary of truth, but for crossing a boundary of class, for writing in her own hand, as though her own witness to history counted as much as anyone else's. Washington could tolerate her sewing the seams of power. It could not tolerate her describing the seams. The needle was acceptable. The pen was not. And so we return to where we began, to a cracked spine at page 211, and to a room on Euclid Street decades later, where an old woman with ruined hands lived out her final years among strangers. Between those 2 points lies a slow, undramatic collapse that the historical record captures only in fragments, the way it tends to for people whose lives stopped being newsworthy the moment they stopped being useful to someone newsworthy. What we know, her dressmaking business never recovered its pre-1868 volume. She took in occasional commissions for years afterward from a smaller and less prestigious clientele, the kind of steady, unglamorous work that keeps a household solvent without ever restoring a reputation. She remained for a time in Washington, in the same city that had once needed her hands on its most powerful dresses, and now, largely, pretended it never had. In the 1890s, well into her 70s, she accepted a position teaching sewing and domestic arts at Wilberforce University in Ohio, one of the oldest black colleges in the country, founded before the war and rebuilt after a fire with the support of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. It is worth pausing on this appointment because it is itself a kind of quiet vindication that the standard telling of her story usually rushes past. The woman Washington society had exiled from its drawing rooms was still trusted, decades later, to shape the next generation's hands, in an institution dedicated to the same project of black uplift and self-sufficiency that had animated her Contraband Relief Association work 30 years earlier. She had not, in her own mind, abandoned that mission. Washington had abandoned her. Wilberforce had not. Her tenure there was brief, by some accounts cut short by declining health, by the ordinary physical toll of a woman in her 70s, whose entire working life had been built on the fine motor precision of hands, now stiffening with age. She returned to Washington, and there, as both her health and her finances gave out in tandem, the way they so often do for people with no pension, no family estate, and no institution obligated to catch them. She was admitted to the National Home for Destitute Colored Women and Children, an institution she had helped establish years before, back when she still had the standing and the funds and the social capital to found things rather than to need them. There is no gentler way to say what that circularity means, and this channel is not in the business of softening its arithmetic for anyone, living or dead. The woman who built a relief organization for refugees of slavery ended her own life as a resident of an institution built on precisely the same charitable model for people with nowhere else to go. She had spent her working life stitching other people's public image together, thread by invisible thread, hour by uncompensated hour beyond the invoice, and when her own public image needed defending, there was no client list left willing to hold it for her. She died in January of 1907, in her late 80s, largely forgotten by the city whose most powerful women she had once dressed, whose most powerful First Lady she had once comforted through the two worst nights of her life. There was no state funeral. There was no column in the papers that had once covered the old clothes scandal with such relish. There was, as far as the surviving record shows, a modest burial arranged by the same benevolent society whose home had sheltered her, and very little else. Her book, Behind the Scenes, would not be seriously reconsidered by historians for the better part of a century. It sat, largely unread, outside a narrow circle of specialists, through the era of Jim Crow, through 2 world wars, through the first stirrings of the civil rights movement, a first-hand account of slavery and the Lincoln White House gathering dust in the very libraries that should have treated it as irreplaceable from the day it was printed. Not until the later 20th century did researchers, chief among them biographer Jennifer Fleischner, whose dual biography of Keckley and Mary Lincoln finally gave the relationship its full weight, begin treating the book not as a servant's indiscretion, but as one of the only first-hand accounts by a black woman who had lived both conditions of American slavery and the innermost private life of a wartime White House. What Washington society called betrayal in 1868, later historians would call irreplaceable primary evidence, the kind no other surviving document could supply. There is a version of this story that ends in vindication, and if you want it, it is technically available to you. Her memoir is read in universities now, assigned in courses on 19th century American history, and on slave narratives as a genre in their own right. Her name appears in serious biographies of Mary Lincoln that could not be honestly written without her testimony, without her letters, without her account of a grieving mother that no one else in that White House was positioned or willing to record for posterity. Museums and historical societies now cite her, not Robert Todd Lincoln, as the authoritative witness to that household's private grief. The book that was suppressed has, in the end, outlived every person who worked to suppress it, including the son who had the money and the motive, and, for a time, very nearly the result he wanted. It is tempting to end there, on the note modern audiences prefer, the arc bending, however slowly, toward recognition. But recognition arrived in academic journals and footnotes. Generations after, it could have paid a single one of her bills, restored a single client, or spared her a single winter in that home on Euclid Street. History rehabilitated her reputation, only once rehabilitating it cost her contemporaries nothing at all. But vindication a century late is not the same as justice in the room where it mattered, and Elizabeth Keckley never lived to see either. She wove herself, thread by careful thread, into the fabric of the most powerful household in the country, at a moment in American history when a black woman's mere presence in that fabric at all was itself an act of extraordinary skill and nerve, invisible labor mistaken by history for simple service. And when she finally pulled on the one thread that was hers alone to pull, her own story, told in her own words, on her own authority, the whole garment came apart in her hands, and it was her name, not theirs, that was left holding the unraveled ends. That is the pattern this channel keeps finding, dynasty after dynasty, decade after decade, in stories that otherwise share almost nothing in common. It was never really about the money, and it was rarely even about the secrets themselves. It was about who is permitted to hold the needle, and who is only ever permitted to be sewn silently into someone else's design.